Meanwhile, the Chinese currency is growing stronger with each passing day. As the world dumps the US dollar, more and more countries are turning to the Chinese yuan. Last week, it was Brazil. It began bilateral trade in the yuan, and now Malaysia has announced its plans. Malaysia wants to set up an Asian monetary fund. Malaysia's Prime Minister is Anwar Ibrahim. He met with Chinese President Xi Jinping last week. Both leaders were in Hainan. Ibrahim informed his parliament about the discussions. He said he was the one who pushed for this idea. And I have some quotes from the Malaysian Prime Minister. When I had a meeting with President Xi Jinping, he immediately said, I refer to Anwar's proposal on the Asian Monetary Fund, and he welcomed discussions. There is no reason for Malaysia to continue depending on the dollar. So Malaysia wants an Asian Monetary Fund, and China supports the idea. But what purpose will it serve? It has two goals. Number one, replace the US dollar with an alternative currency. And number two, reduce reliance on the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the lender of last resort for countries. The IMF bails out countries in economic distress. China and Malaysia want to build an alternative to the IMF. They want to kill two birds with one stone, create an Asian IMF and curb dependence on the US dollar. And in both ways, they challenge the United States. Because the US dollar is still the dominant global currency and the US government still has an outsized influence on the IMF, which also explains why China is interested in the project. Although it's not really a new idea, it was first proposed by Japan back in the 1990s. This was during the Asian financial crisis. Asian economies were under considerable stress then. There was a series of currency devaluations. It began with Thailand. It spread to Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, even South Korea, which was this close to a government default. The IMF bailed them out, but it also imposed very tough conditions. There was a lot of discontent among Asian nations. They thought some of the IMF's demands were unfair, and that's when the idea of an Asian monetary fund was born. It was supposed to be a counter to the IMF, an institution to help Asian countries overcome financial challenges. But the idea never really took off. The proposal led to disagreements between Japan and the US. The US pushed back hard against the idea. No prizes for guessing why. The Asian Monetary Fund would have challenged the IMF. It would have weakened the American influence in Asia. So the Americans were not in favor of it. As for China, it was reluctant. It did not want to back Japan's proposal. So the plan was DOA, dead on arrival. But today it is being revived, and in very different circumstances. The American influence on the world is on the decline, and China is no longer a reluctant power. It wants to challenge American hegemony, and it's not shy of wielding its currency, the yuan, as a weapon. The war in Ukraine has also helped. It has contributed to the rise of the yuan. In Russia, for instance, the Chinese currency has already replaced the dollar. The yuan is now the most traded currency in Russia. Most of Russia's financial assets are now held in yuan. Earlier this year, Russia's finance ministry converted its assets. It developed a new structure for Russia's National Wealth Fund. And this fund now holds 60% of its assets in the Chinese yuan. The Bank of Russia is Russia's central bank, and it likes the yuan. The Russian bank now regularly advises citizens and companies to convert their assets, to move away from the US dollar and to switch to either the ruble or other friendly currencies like the yuan. That's the term they use, friendly currencies. So Russia is shifting. So are some ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. They're ditching the dollar. They're settling trade in local currencies. The trend is quite clear. The Chinese yuan is going places and it's finding takers. The American dollar is losing friends. China's expansionism knows no bounds. First Doklam, then Eastern Ladakh, and now Arunachal Pradesh. China has launched a new campaign to provoke India. It is renaming parts of Arunachal Pradesh. Arunachal Pradesh is a state in India. China is targeting 11 places in this state. It has issued new names, Chinese names, for these places. And India has hit back with a sharp response. This episode began on Sunday. Chinese Ministry of Civil Affairs released a list. It had 11 places with a map. All these places are in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, and China is claiming all of these as Chinese territory. Beijing says these places are part of what it calls southern Tibet. It has a Chinese name for Arunachal Pradesh. Beijing calls it Zhangnan. And the new Chinese map, the one that was released on Sunday, shows most of Arunachal Pradesh. It has 5 mountain peaks, 2 land areas, 2 residential areas and 2 rivers. One of the towns on this list is close to Itanagar. Itanagar is the capital of Arunachal Pradesh in India. So China is taking claim by giving Chinese names to Indian towns. And this is not a first. The Chinese have tried this before. In 2017, the Dalai Lama visited Arunachal Pradesh. China did not like it. It retaliated with a list with Chinese names for 6 Indian towns or regions. Then in 2021, China released another list. This one had 15 places. And now in 2023, there's a new list with 11 names on it. How does it help? What does China gain by giving Chinese names to Indian territories? It's a way to build pressure. It's a way to needle India. And China's justification is unbelievable. It says it's just standardizing geographical names. I have a copy of the Chinese notification with me, the one that sparked the latest row. Listen to what it says. According to the relevant provisions of the State Council on the Management of Geographical Names, China's Ministry of Civil Affairs, together with relevant departments, has standardized some geographical names in southern Tibet. The third batch of supplementary place names for public use in southern Tibet, 11 in total, is now officially announced. It's a carefully worded statement, and it has one clear takeaway. This order came from the top. China's top leadership is the driving force behind this. And how did we reach this conclusion? Because this is a formal official order released by China's Ministry of Civil Affairs, and this is in line with instructions from China's State Council. The State Council is the cabinet of the Chinese government. So I repeat, the decision came from the top. And China has made a unilateral declaration here. It violates India's sovereignty. What is India's reaction? New Delhi has issued a firm statement. Here's what the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi said, and I'm quoting, "This is not the first time China has made such an attempt. We reject this outright. Arunachal Pradesh is, has been, and will always be an integral and inalienable part of India. Attempts to assign invented names will not alter this reality." So that's a clear message from New Delhi. And this statement, like similar statements in the past, will not alter the reality that China claims the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. This is a long-standing dispute. India and China share a border that is 3,488 kilometers long. The border is not demarcated, and China misuses this fact. There are repeated flare-ups. The border is divided into 3 areas: the western sector, which is around Ladakh, the middle sector that covers Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. Tibet is on the other side of this boundary, that's the middle sector. And the third area is the eastern sector, around Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim. And this is the area, the eastern sector, that we're talking about today. Now, time for a quick history lesson. The boundary in the eastern sector is called the McMahon Line. It is the de facto border. It was drawn in the year 1914 during the British Raj. I'm talking about the famous Shimla Convention. That's when leaders from Britain, China and Tibet met. The convention was called to settle the boundary dispute. At that time, Tibet was still free and China was trying to push its claims on the region. India was still under the British rule, this is 1914, and India was represented by Sir Arthur Henry McMahon, the then Foreign Secretary, which is why this border is called the McMahon Line. It is named after the British Foreign Secretary of 1914. So in Shimla, they presented a proposal to resolve the border dispute, but China refused to sign it because China said it owns Tibet and that Tibet had no independent authority to enter into international agreements. China did not like the fact that Tibet was being represented as a separate entity in this convention. But Tibet was there, and the draft was signed by 2 of the 3 parties. China did not sign it. The British government that ruled India signed it, and the Tibetan government in Lhasa also signed it. The Tibetans were represented by a man called Paljor Dorje Shatra. He was as good as their prime minister. And China objected to all of this, specifically to the status of Tibet. But China did not object to the McMahon line, and this is very important. For 45 years, the Chinese never raised any formal objections to the McMahon line. Then in 1959, they shifted abruptly. China's Prime Minister at the time was Zhou Enlai. In 1959, he wrote a letter to Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Listen to what he said in that letter. This is the Chinese Prime Minister saying, the so-called McMahon line was a product of the British policy of aggression against the Tibet region of China and has never been recognized by any Chinese central government and is therefore decidedly illegal. And this is the origin of China's claims on Arunachal Pradesh, a flawed interpretation of history, a version that suits China's expansionist agenda. During the 1962 war, Chinese forces crossed the McMahon line. They made deep inroads into India, but then they also retreated after announcing a unilateral ceasefire. And now, almost 6 decades later, China is reigniting the dispute. It is changing names and staking claim to Arunachal Pradesh, and the timing is typical. Every time there's an important engagement with India, the Chinese side provokes. And this month, India is hosting the defense ministers of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. Both India and China are members, and this year, India holds the rotating presidency of this group. China's defense minister is expected to attend the meeting in India, and the Chinese side is playing its old games. The question is, what should India do? Should India reconsider the invite? Or should it host the Chinese and confront them with their claims? Whatever India chooses to do, one thing is certain: silence won't help. China sees silence as a sign of weakness, and it only understands the language of strength. So India should use its presidency and its global clout to call out China's provocations. The US, for one, is speaking out against China and also walking the talk for a change. This week, the Americans have opened a new front against Beijing. It's about a simple question: is China a developing country? US lawmakers say it's not. They say China is not a developing country, and they introduced a bill in the US House of Representatives. That's the lower house of the US Congress. The bill is aptly titled, "The People's Republic of China is Not a Developing Country Act." There's no room for doubt. It spells out what it wants to say very clearly. It is addressed to the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The bill says Blinken should launch a diplomatic campaign at international organizations. He should ensure that China is stripped of the label of a developing country. And this bill has been passed unanimously. 415 to 0, that's the final tally of votes. 415 to 0, it tells you how strong the sentiment against China is. Every lawmaker in American House, the US House, voted in favor of this bill. It now moves to the Senate for a vote. And it's not just the US that is pushing for this. Europe too believes that China should not be categorized as developing. In October 2021, the European Union published a review. Here's what it said about China, and I'm quoting. One way for China to show leadership would be by refraining from claiming benefits that would correspond to a developing country in ongoing negotiations. And Australia is of the same view. In 2021, Australia asked China to give up its access to special and differential treatment as a developing country. So the idea has wide support. But why is this distinction important? How does it matter if China is called developed or developing? Do these labels really have any meaning? Well, they do, and they do make a lot of difference. As of today, all leading international organizations bracket China as a developing country. We're talking about the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, or WTO. All of them call China developing. And on what basis do they do this? How is one country called developing and another called developed? You see, each organization has its own criteria. The World Bank, for instance, classifies countries on the basis of gross national income. But the WTO does not accept this definition. In fact, the WTO has no benchmarks whatsoever. At the World Trade Organization, every member can allocate itself into the group it wants to. So each member decides how it wants to be categorized. The WTO has 164 members. And 2/3 of these members call themselves developing countries. That's around 109 countries. They're developing. And India is part of this list. So is China. As per the rules, if China wants to call itself developing, then it will be labeled as a developing country at the World Trade Organization. But why does China want this label? Because it translates into significant gains for Beijing. Developing countries get some benefits. They can take longer to implement a deal. They also get more trade and they get preferential treatment. The idea is to help developing countries, to give them a better playing field. But China has been accused of misusing these privileges. There's a long list of charges against China, like preferential treatment for state enterprises, data restrictions, lack of enforcement of intellectual property rules. Basically, China rigs the global system in its favor. That's the charge against it. Of course, China denies it. But even then, its label as a developing country is hard to justify, really. China is the world's second largest economy. It accounts for 18.6% of the global economy. It has the most billionaires in the world, the highest number. Out of the world's top 100 companies, 14 are Chinese. And yet China wants to be called developing because it wants to enjoy special benefits. It wants the same perks as countries like Zimbabwe and Papua New Guinea get. And as of today, it is getting those perks, thanks to loopholes in the international system. There is no definition of a developing country because the world cannot agree to a definition. Just like there's no accepted definition of terrorist, because on issues that matter the most, there's usually no consensus. So the China of fact-check books is still developing. Can American influence strip China of this title? We'll have to wait to find out.